Hi there, everyone. Today we're going to look at limiting factors and how they can affect populations. And so we're going to explain the difference between density-dependent and density-independent factors. We're going to look at characteristics of a population and then how organisms can arrange themselves within a population. And then we're also going to take a look at survivorship curves as well and compare and contrast differences between them. So first we need to know what a population is. We've already discussed that a population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in a defined area. And so there's a number of things that we need to take into consideration when we look at a population. One of those is population size. Sometimes population size can stay the same, but that's probably not going to happen unless there are limited resources. But some things that cause a population to change in size is due to immigration, which is organisms moving out of the population. Another immigration, which means that they are moving into the population, so you'll see an increase in population size. And then we have birth rate and death rate. So what happens if there are unlimited resources and these organisms can continue to grow and produce more offspring? We'll actually see something called exponential growth. And exponential growth is when your population increases in size because there's nothing that's going to limit the growth. Now let's compare that to what we call logistic growth. Logistic growth occurs when our population size increases, and many times that's going to be exponentially. But then we get close to this thing called carrying capacity, which we use K to represent. It's very important to note that at some point in time, all populations will reach carrying capacity. It could be that the space is not available for more organisms to live, and so there's competition against living space or for living space. It could be food. It could be mates. It could be a number of things that cause a population to reach carrying capacity, and they will have logistic growth, meaning that the population size will stay around this carrying capacity. You may see some slight increases and some decreases, but overall will average at this carrying capacity. All right, so population density is something else that we have to take into consideration. Population density is the number of organisms in a particular population in the defined area. And so if we take us, for example, our population in the United States, you can see that we have high population densities on the East Coast. It's kind of spaced out a little more on the West Coast, but you do have areas of very high population density. But basically, we're looking at the number of individuals per given unit, and in this case, it's per square mile. We have a lot of high population density in Columbia and over here near Charleston. All right, so I discussed carrying capacity and that there are things that can limit the growth of a population, and so the population will meet carrying capacity. Well, there's actually two different categories of limiting factors. There's density-independent limiting factors and density-dependent limiting factors. So let's look at both of them. A density-independent limiting factor is not going to take into account population density. It's going to limit the population no matter what the size of the population or how dense it is. So natural disasters, other environmental factors, or even human interactions can occur, and that can decrease the size of the population. Or let's say I have organisms that thrive on waste from animals. If we put out a lot of waste, those organisms will thrive in that particular area, and so we could actually see a population increase, and it doesn't necessarily have to be dependent upon how many individuals are in that population or in that particular area. So it doesn't depend on density. On the other hand, you have density-dependent factors, and usually these limiting factors are going to limit the population because if there's too many in the population, you'll have some issues. So for example, like I brought up the fact for living space, organisms of the same species will compete against one another for living space, for mates, for food. We also have to take into account predation. As our prey increase in number, so do our predators, and so the number of prey will decrease, and our number of predators will decrease, and so it's a cyclic occurrence that we have here. Parasitism, the more individuals within a defined area that you have, and the closer they are to each other, the more disease and parasites are going to be able to be passed around, and so that would limit a population size. And then also habitat and food availability, like I said before. And so that brings us to niches. Niches are what the organism does in its particular ecosystem. What is its role in the environment? And so there's two different types of niches. There's fundamental niches and there's realized niches. Fundamental niches will occur when I have organisms that can, it's the total area in which they can reside and what they can do in that particular area. So if we look at the fundamental niches of these organisms right here, okay, these two right here, they're types of barnacles. All right, so I have the brown barnacle and the blue barnacle. Okay, if you see, the fundamental niche of the blue barnacle is from here to here. Okay, so it can go from here to here, and that's it. However, the brown niche, it can span the entire rock. It can withstand the dryness of high tide and the water and low tide, or excuse me, the water and high tide and the dryness and low tide. So it can span this entire area. This is its fundamental niche. Okay. However, because of competition, what we have is that in the fundamental niche, the blue barnacle can outcompete the brown barnacle. However, the blue barnacle can't reside up here where the brown one can, and so its fundamental niche is the same as its realized niche because it can outcompete the brown. However, the brown one has this huge fundamental niche, but its realized niche is really small. It doesn't have to compete against the blue barnacle up here. And so here's the blue, here is the, or excuse me, this was the brown one, this one's the blue one. So the fundamental is the possible location of the niche. The realized is the actual niche due to competition. All right, so now we want to look at how organisms can be situated within a population. Organisms can be very clumped together. So I think of schools of fish. So I have a clump right here, a clump right here, maybe thinking of a family, you know. And this is due to resources that are available and that they can obtain as a little clump, and then also living space. They may share a living space. So that's clumped. Random is when you have, and we see this a lot of times with flowers or plants, they live very independently of one another, and it's not necessarily that they have to compete too much against resources within that population, but is very randomly dispersed. And we see a lot of individuals or a lot of species and populations with this type of disbursement. And then lastly, we have uniform dispersion, where these organisms, like these penguins, are going to uniformly disperse, and so that way there's a maximum amount of distance between one individual and the next. And we'll see this with penguins whenever they're protecting their eggs. So that's uniform dispersion. So those are the ways that organisms can disperse themselves within a population or within the ecosystem. Now, it's very interesting that not all organisms are like us. If you think about the fact that each of your parents had few offspring, you don't really hear of individuals having, tens and up to 20s and so forth with the number of offspring that they have. It's usually between one, maybe four or five. And randomly you'll hear those large number families, but it's kind of rare. But there's a reason for that. So let's look at these survivorship curves. Species like us that have a type 1 survivorship curve, you'll see, we have a very high survivorship throughout life. And if you see, if our percentage of life between these organisms is very different, like we live a lot longer than these organisms. And so what we see is that the typical age of a individual, so let's say it's 75, okay, or just to make the numbers even, let's say 70 or 80, because we're getting a little bit better with healthcare now. So let's say around after the age of 40, we see the number of individuals slightly decline. However, when we get older in life, that's when we see our survivorship decrease. A big deal. You don't see very many centurions, okay? With type 2 mortality, it's the same throughout life. And so it's not going to make a difference how old they are. They have an equal chance of dying no matter what stage of life they're in. And then type 3 mortality, we have very high mortality in the younger time span of life. And then if they survive to be older, then their likelihood of dying doesn't necessarily, well, it does decrease the survivorship. They do tend to survive, but it's not like humans do, I guess. And so individuals with type 3 mortality are going to have many, 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 many offspring because they know that there's a, or they don't know, but they do not have a very high survivorship early on in life. Whereas with humans and other large mammals, we don't have a high mortality rate, and so we put a lot of time and effort and energy into our young ones, and then they go off and be adults on their own. All right, so that's going to be it for this lecture. We're going to come and look at limiting factors in Lake Winnipeg when we return to class.